Welcome, everybody, to our conversation today. My name is Jesse James. I'm the design director here at Exygy, and I'm joined today by Mike Gifford from CivicActions. Um, Today, we are going to dig into how we ask questions. Mike and I have talked previously in Exygy's podcast called Impact Bites. We talked about accessibility, and we also dug into roles and responsibilities, how accessibility is not just one person's job, it's many people's job. Recently, Mike and his team released a new draft of ARM, which is the Accessibility Roles and Responsibilities Mapping guidelines through WCAG. Hopefully, we'll have some time to talk about that and how that kind of connects in principle to some of the things when it comes to working with accessibility and multifunctional teams, and a little bit about content. Um, like I said, today our topic is equitable forms, which is a little, it's not just accessible forms, but also equitable forms, so not just the technology itself, but it kind of gets into the content and the overall experience of that. And how we can be mindful specifically about the questions we ask, why we ask them. In the public sector, when we build these forms and people are applying for benefits programs, the questions we choose to ask carry with them like lots of responsibility, especially around people in vulnerable situations. Um, one of the this is a webinar is about Bloom, the affordable housing platform that helps people centralize how and what to apply for. It's an open source effort, helps local governments centralize within jurisdictions, uh, giving people one place they can go to make it easier to find and apply for opportunities. At the center of Bloom is a common application form that has taken us quite a while to try to get right. The form simplifies and standardizes the questions asked and that are needed to pre-qualify residents for housing. On Bloom, we recognize the stakes are higher when you're filling out these forms. We've identified some underlying principles that kind of help us guide us in how we kind of create this form. And so the general and this will kind of guide our conversation today is like first we only ask for the information that we need, having a clear and repeatable protocol that can help align stakeholders and policymakers and content creators around the information we're trying to get here, keeping it simple. So if we need to ask questions, we can structure those questions, even though they might be complicated, in the simplest way possible to help people actually be successful in giving us the information that we need. And finally, we need to be mindful of sensitive questions and sensitive information. We want to consider the needs of our audience and determine if those questions we're asking, how we're asking them, and then once we have that information, we communicate what we're going to do with that information. So um, this is just here to kind of orient ourselves and get us started. The bulk of today's conversation will just be between Mike and I as we kind of dig into some of this stuff. And so I've talked a lot, and I'll turn it over to Mike to introduce himself and some of the work that he's currently working on.
Thank you, Jesse. Mike Gifford, the Civic Actions Open Standards and Practices lead. I also lead our accessibility program and do work on digital sustainability as well. I'm a Drupal core accessibility maintainer, which is a lot of where I have exercised and looked at complicated forms and the challenges of creating complicated forms. I'm also an invited expert within the Web Accessibility Initiative. So helping both with the ARM community group, there's the accessible roles and responsibilities mapping, as well as the on the, not with the WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative, but there's also a web sustainability working or web sustainability interest group, and I'm on that as well. And looking forward to this presentation or this discussion. It's been really interesting to sort of see the work that Bloom has done and to get some insights into the level of care that you're putting into seeing that your users are being protected.
Again, I'm not sure if people have been joining as we've kind of done the intro, but again, feel free to chime in the Zoom, let people know where you're coming from. And this will be fairly informal, just be a back and forth between Mike and I. But if things come up as we move through the Q&A, feel free to put those questions in the Slack and we'll kind of like read through it and kind of try to answer your questions as we go. And we'll hold time at the end for larger questions we might want to dig into once we're done. So, to start with, a lot of questions, a lot of forms out there are are bad. Um, and so, and I think a lot of that it's not done intentionally, right? It's not, it's like I don't think anybody seeks to make a bad form. I think we end up with forms that are kind of overly complicated or questions that are like legacy questions we've always asked. So, my first question for you is, what are some of the misconceptions around the questions we feel like we need to ask and why we ask them? And what are some common assumptions that you've heard that lead us to ending up with forms in their current state, especially when it comes to people who are applying for benefits programs such as affordable housing?
Um, so I think it really this is an important time to go off and to talk about what the forum is. The forum is an interaction between a citizen and often a government representative that they're working with, but that requires trust. And trust isn't a one-way relationship; it's a two-way relationship. There's a woman named Pia Andrews who's done some really amazing work on trying to flesh this out and trying to explain to as a government employee how should it be that governments are thinking about trust, because it's not just about making sure that the person who's filling in the form is who they say they are, and they're not trying to go off and to get services that they're not qualified for, but really that they're trusting the data that they're providing, their time and their efforts, and often really sensitive information that they have to you. So how do you manage that trust and hold that trust in care? Because we are often asking a lot for citizens when we're creating these forms. Um, the other thing is just to keep in mind that there are occasionally governments that will set up processes that are overly complicated because they actually don't want people to apply for the benefits that they're eligible for. So making a complicated form or making a form, making the process overly complicated or intimidating is actually one way to reduce the number of people who are applying for that particular form. And there are some people who believe that this is a measure of a good and responsible government because they want to make sure that only those people who are absolutely qualified are applying for the whatever benefit that they're looking for. But I think that we need to realize that the government is not like an insurance agency, and we do need to be able to like the benefits that citizens have are things that we should be not trying to find ways to weasel out of delivering that service that they are owed as being citizens of the country. But as far as how bad forms get implemented, so much of the time in government, I think it's just coming down to copying and pasting. That they've seen what other forms are like. They've tried to go off and replicate that process because that got approval before, and they're often under pressure to make sure that they're doing it right and they're asking all the right questions, and so it's a that pressure to go off and to simply replicate what has worked before is something that is I think has led to a lot of bad forms being replicated because we're not really learning about what specifically needs to be asked for in this particular issue.
Got it. Um, I've seen this pattern that you mentioned before around um, intentionally putting barriers up. I think it's a way around policy design. I've heard them called speed bumps before,
Mhm.
but as a desire to lower overall, because capacity is limited on the receiving side of the applications to review a large quantity of them, that in creating intentional barriers helps with that capacity, which I think in some departments is seen as like, an overall benefit. Like if less people apply, that means I have less people to move through and I'll get to more valid applicants sooner. Um, but the speed bumps that I've seen aren't necessarily yeah, useful ones, or they're not ones that serve a direct one-to-one purpose, right? They can um by design make it provide friction that keeps people from applying to something
Right.
um smoothly. Um
And
let's see.
captions are a great example of that as a a type of form element or form interaction that excludes a lot of people because they either yeah don't have the ability to go off and fill in the pieces that are forcing them to go off and prove that they're human and not a machine.
Yeah. Um Let's move into the solution space. So this is the problem space. We've got this space where we there's not a whole lot of guidelines around the questions we're asking, how we kind of get there. One of the solutions is to have more rigor and structure around asking yourself why you're asking the question before you ask it. So, and this thing that organizations can do is called a question protocol. And things on that list, that checklist are: why do we need this information? Who will have access to this information once we collect it? What are the privacy implications of holding this information for our organization? And is there any other way to get this information? Quote unquote, do we already have this information? Rather than, or is there another organization or that has this information that I could get that information from, rather than asking for this information directly from the applicant. Um, when I when I first asked you to do this panel or this webinar with me, I in my head I kind of connected the 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 you'd have to get a multiple people together in order to like really have that conversation on what the question protocol is. You'd have to get policymakers together with engineers, with content designers. You have to get them all in the room if you're going to answer any of those questions like succinctly. So I did see how it kind of connected with this idea of like a clear roles and responsibilities, especially around like technology development. So yeah, what yeah, I'll just open it up from there and kind of see what you think about generally that as a practice, why that might be easy or hard for some organizations to do, and how it might, again, yeah, connect to this need for cross-functional collaboration.
So first of all, I believe it's important to imagine what is possible, and the way that we currently interact with governments generally is it's very much filling in the same information over and over and over again. Most people are not aware that there is actually a different way that governments around the world are organizing to try and implement a different way of collecting information and managing and maintaining information about their citizens. So I signed up to be an e-resident, and with this little card here, I can sign into an Estonian government website, and with that, I can fill in as much information as I want to with the Estonian government, and I will never be asked for the same information twice because they have a policy on board about not asking for any information more than once. So that's actually legislation that government organizations are not going to be able to ask for that same information over and over again. And if you take that approach and say, okay, well, how much of government forms can be eliminated because they already have the information. If you can prove who you are, if you have a single login identification system that you can use to verify digitally who you are, you can eliminate a lot of what is currently in the web form. And the government already has a lot of information that it doesn't need to ask for us again. And frankly, there's some real security issues if you have every agency who's asking you for information, collecting all of this information that then is sitting, in their filing cabinets if it's submitted, or printed out in some way, or electronically. Maybe it's on a USB key somewhere. Maybe it's on multiple USB keys. It's just much harder to go up and manage and organize the data if you if you're letting everyone go and manage it their own way through their own systems that they set up and are responsible for securing, it is a much better process to try and centralize it, make sure that it's organized in a way that is really set up to to see that there's maximum protection of both security, but also of individual privacy, so that nobody's looking at your files that shouldn't be looking at your files. And Stony has done a great job with that. Um, with the accessible roles and responsibilities mapping, one thing that we've done with that is try and look at all of all of the specific success criteria with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, and to break that up into who's responsible for it. So is it something that a designer needs to deal with it? Is it a visual issue, like a visual design issue? Is it a front-end issue? Is this really a business problem? And so by breaking it down into the individual teams, we can try and clarify who and how is responsible, who is responsible for meeting those accessibility criteria. And one of the interesting things is that there's a lot of situations where multiple roles are involved, and that is a primary and secondary and contributing role that is responsible for many of the success criteria. So there isn't just one person who can fix the accessibility problems, because it may involve the whole team. And if there's a team who's developing this, so partly there's an effort to try and shift this so that we're moving from having an accessibility expert that is given the responsibility for making sure that a website meets uh, WK requirements, and simply saying that the whole team has responsibilities, and that the definition of quality is going to, for each of the roles and responsibilities that is building this new web form, is going to have to think about accessibility from their perspective. So from a visual designer, what are they going to need to think about when they're designing this form? What are the elements that are of WCAG that are tied to them? I think that's a really interesting way to try and break this down. And when you're dealing with the government benefits and forms, you also have to think about not just the desktop and mobile, but also what is your paper experience? What is you may be taking some applications over the phone if people are calling up a call center. So how do you try and provide a consistent level of service so that however you're engaging with your citizens or your clients, whoever they are, that there's a level of care that is a consistent kind of information that's available for whoever's talking or communicating with your service. And I also like to highlight that there's other roles that are responsible for that we have to think about aside from just the public. The public role is a really important one. Who are your users? Getting a sense of who that public the public is who's consuming your services, and trying to communicate and write for them. But we often overlook the role of the data analyst, or the program officer, or even the form author. Like, who is it who's, how do we make sure that the information that we're collecting is being set up so that it's actually understandable for the person who's consuming and organizing that data. So for every team, you might one of the aspects of ARM is a process to go through and to look at what your issues are, and figure out how your team deals with them, and who are the people who need to make decisions on them, particularly for those issues where people get stuck, when there isn't a clear person who can just fix a particular accessibility issue. Often they get stuck and lodged in the issue queue, but this is a process to help people go through and work and implement them. And when you're collecting personal information, going back to the top, I think that the personally identifiable information should be really considered technical debt. So any information you're asking of your applicants will need to be stored securely until that information is destroyed. And you're going to need to make sure that it's destroyed correctly. So every hard drive it's on, everyone who has access to that, anyone who's doing the testing and evaluation of that software. So the more information you're collecting about people, the more redundancy there is in the forms you're creating, the bigger security implications you have.
No, I love all that. I think there's a basic instinct when you're asking a form, like, I only have you for a limited amount of time, so let me get all the information I can while I'm here. Or we've always asked for social security number. Doesn't
Mhm.
everybody have a social security number? Like, can't we just get it? And the truth is, not everybody does have one, and like you said, there are liabilities with holding that information. So even on the client side, I think there's a disconnect between the the person who is a little anxious about the getting all the information that they can, and you're right, they themselves may have partners within their own organization who aren't in alignment with them, who think, well, actually, we don't want, or we can only hold that for a certain amount of time, or for the way that this information is shared, we need to be able to anonymize it in these use cases, and only expose it in these use cases, and have like a whole, yeah, like a trusted governance transfer of information like agreement that we have in place. So uh, one of the outcomes here that I wanted to highlight was like, and I think you touched on this a little bit, is like, if we do our jobs right, maybe we actually don't need to ask the question at all. So like, what is the joke? The best form in the world is no form, right? I don't need the form because I have the information,
Yeah.
and we talked a little bit in our preparation for this call, is some of the best forms out there. Um, the information that's gathered isn't asked for from the individual, but is all you're doing with the form is saying, yes, I would like this benefit. And then someone else is doing the burden of collecting that information because that information already exists. And then the recipient just receives that information. So the stuff we talked about was the attempt at doing student loan forgiveness was actually one of the most minimal forms you've ever seen, right? All you had to do is say, I would like this. And then behind the scenes, all the work was done to find out whether or not you were eligible. Um, and, and then, yeah, the other thing we talked about was, once the information is provided, how do we autofill that information now? So in subsequent forms that I fill out, like, I've only give it to you once, and then it's kind of used again, and I don't have to do the additional burden of refilling out that information. Um, just looking through the questions here. And you might have time to do one. Let's do the second question. Comparing motivation versus ability, what do you think holds up accessible form creation the most? For example, are inaccessible forms created because people creating them don't prioritize designing for accessibility, or do they just not know how to do it the right way? Did you want to take a
Yeah. I
stab at
mean,
that?
I think that forms are complicated, and web forms. A lot of people get form accessibility wrong, um, if you look at many of the tools that are available to create forms, they're not necessarily um, they're not necessarily building in accessibility best practices in them. I've been very impressed within the Drupal community about the Drupal web form module, which has done a lot to try and build in accessibility defaults by as you install the module, it's designing to try and support and organize accessibility best practices as people are creating that. But that's very rare. If you're looking at a tool like SurveyMonkey or other tools that are creating forms, they might be quite accessible on the front end, but they're often inaccessible on the back end. So if you're either creating the form or trying to process the form, they're not really designed to optimize that level of accessibility, because there hasn't been enough demand for it, and they haven't built it to try and support the idea that authors, or that the public sector employees might have disabilities as part of that. But ultimately it comes down to it being complicated, and people also wanting to modify things at the last minute. Like, forms are also sometimes things that people will make changes to, and not realize that those changes have implications for accessibility. And Yeah, I think we'll touch. Yeah, I think things like form errors are a real challenge for most automated accessibility testing as well.
I think, yeah, you started with forms are complicated, and I think it's like really true. And sometimes we want to. So if the goal is to ask as few questions as possible, sometimes we do actually have to ask
Mhm.
hard things. And so, like in affordable housing, we kind of do have to ask people about their income, right?
Mhm.
But that can be kind of a complicated thing to do. So, especially for several reasons, tech literacy, dyscalculia, there are lots of reasons that like asking somebody on their spot for like an accurate estimation of their income can be stressful. So that's just one example, but what are some issues that come up to make that some types of questions more complicated than they need to be? What are some easy fixes when it comes to asking hard questions? And what are some things that are just not going to get any easier and what do you do when things are just difficult?
It's always useful to try and do your best not to overwhelm the people you're asking this information from. I remember years ago there was a Drupal tool that was what would Seth Godin do, and it was essentially a way to try and take that initial application to join a website or to become part of an online community and break it down so that you're not getting asked everything all at once. You get it asked in stages, so that's in small discrete chunks as you're using the site, as you're building the trust in the site. But it is a different way of approaching how we engage with our users, because we're used to being presented with all the information you could ever possibly ask for right at the first, and often people just fill in everything that's required and just move on because it's they want to accomplish their top task, which might be seeing who else is online. It might be who knows what the top task is that they've come in to join that online community. But often it's not filling in the form that is actually just the step that they need to do in order to get to the task they're trying to accomplish. Um, I also think that there's ways that we can design smarter forms so that if we know some issues, if we can ask a simpler question, that we can quickly eliminate some elements. Like if we know if you've completed your taxes or if you have your taxes on hand, you might be able to just simply ask for, can you give us the tax number? If you have your taxes available, can you tell us what the taxes are in cells, E35, and that, if that is an appropriate form ID, they might be able to provide that information for the user. But if they don't have that information available, then maybe you might want to ask something else that is maybe not as precise, but something that would allow them to carry on with the process. And maybe you'd ask them with more. Maybe you'd send them a follow-up email to say, now you've completed their initial registration. We'd love for you to go off and also tell us this information. Can you look for your tax return, or provide these other sources that will verify your income and give us that availability. Um, it is interesting. I gotta say, I don't know enough about dyslexia as I would like to. There's a lot of resources available on dyslexia and dyscalculia. You gave me a really great podcast to listen to, which I've now listened to a couple of them, Jesse, and really interesting to sort of have people discuss how their impressions of health information and other information from government is can be dramatically affected, and just even saying the difference between 10% and 1 out of 10 can make it, saying 1 out of 10 is something that more people will be able to understand than saying 10%, which if you're a math guy, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's a lot of people in this world who are not math people, so that's something that's worthwhile thinking about. I've posted in a couple different links in here that are useful to think about personas and more information about dyscalculia as part of that. But a lot of this comes down to, can you provide the information in other ways? Can you simplify it? Can you provide visuals? Are there videos that may be relevant for people to get more information? And if you're asking for a lot of information, can people save it? Is there a timeout factor? And if somebody's applying for some of these services from their cell phone, or sorry, if they're applying to it from a library, for instance, which a lot of people, if you don't have a personal computer, might go to a library to do that. How do you make sure that if people are saving, if information is being stored locally, that it's not something that is going to be going to compromise their privacy if they once they close down the terminal, or the cookies that would potentially provide security concerns for people who are using that service. Um,
Sounds right. Yeah. I put the thanks for the link. If people want to check the chat, the references that Mike made to Jerry Reed has some resources, and then Accessible Numbers is the podcast. Laura Parker runs that podcast. It's great. A lot of really good tips in there for sort of addressing and dealing with numbers, especially like just a segue about that. It's like especially in affordable housing, like people are like financially stressed, and financial stress actually brings with it financial guilt. Like they don't want to be in these situations. They already have like an emotional connection to like they don't want to be applying to something that's called affordable. Like there's a lot of baggage there, and there's a lot of stress in that moment. We're asking somebody for a number, and if they don't give you the right number, they won't have a place to sleep. So it's a lot going on in these moments. So what can we do to kind of help people along? Which kind of leads us into our next question, which is that life events happen, right? Not to focus on the homelessness piece so much, or the housing instability piece so much, but life events such as divorce, bereavement, immigration status, a lots of these things are the reasons that we need services, and whether or not we get it right, like affects if we're going to get assistance, and so that adds stress. So what can policymakers, content designers do in these situations to help kind of affect and assist? We currently not so at Exygy, we don't just have this stuff in affordable housing. We've also worked with CROP, which is an organization works with people who are formerly incarcerated and entering the workforce. And there's a whole process we've designed to kind of take them through. And they're bringing with them lots of baggage around where they're coming from and how they're kind of entering into this new life. Um, and we were really conscious about that process and designing a form experience that kind of like held their hand a little bit. And we can kind of dig into some of those details about how we kind of did that. But I wanted to ask you specifically about your own experience with, or this like just general insight you might have into this space of designing for these moments and these situations. What we can do as form designers, because there are some things we can do from a content perspective, and even from like error messaging, which we can kind of dig into as well, around like when people get it wrong, like what can we do to kind of help people so we don't lose them, but we kind of like, yeah, kind of carry them along.
so thank you. There's these are really great and detailed introductory discussion sort of items. So that's great. Um, First of all, I think that building a good authoring experience is useful. Like a lot of people who are creating these forms may not have experience in trauma informed design. Probably they don't. Most people don't have that ability, and I know I have not. I don't have experience in trauma informed design, and in terms of wordsmithing something like. I'm not the kind of wordsmith that you want to go off and to be writing sensitive forms in any context. That there are other people who are much better at that. Heck, I think that using AI is probably better than that, and partly that's because you can, if you're using a tool like AI, you can provide multiple examples. You can voice the same question or the same need in multiple different ways, and making sure you've got some options available there so that people can understand how they could potentially be phrasing that same question in different ways is useful. So don't hesitate to try and use AI to try and come up with different alternatives to try and say, describe your user and the reading level and be able to get information out from an AI to help you consider different ways of phrasing the same thing. But there's really nothing that beats the experience of users. So doing user research for these questions is you can't beat that. I keep talking about the idea that the map is not the terrain, or Cessna peep, like this is not a pipe. The idea that the model is just a model. So whether you're talking about the web content accessibility guidelines, or you're talking about tools like ACTS or accessibility insights, like these are just tools to help you understand sort of best practices. But the real expert in anything, if you know you've got it right, if your users are able to fill in the form and are able to use that and understand what they're filling in properly. Um, I'd love to see more research around stressed out users and engaging with stressed out users, because frankly, in this day and age, there's a lot of people who are more stressed out than is healthy to do. And if you're assuming that your user is totally at ease when they're filling in these forms and is is communicating at their top intellectual capacity, then you're probably mistaken, because most often people are filling in these forms under pressure, when there's kids screaming in the background, when there's other demands and other things that are pulling their attention away. They don't have the full time to sit down and to consider the implications and the questions, and to take the time with it as you would want them to, because we're all very busy, and there's a lot of things pulling at our attention in an attention economy. Um, I did like at one point, being based in Ottawa, Canada. Shopify was started up here, and so I was listening to some Shopify user researchers at one point, and they were trying to do user research on drunk users, because it was it's a more fun way to go off and get information from users, and to be able to sort of say, if your users are operating under less than ideal situations, how would you want to build your forms, and how would you construct it so that they can accomplish their task, regardless of what state they're in, intellectually. So again, how do we try and build for users in whatever needs that they're working with right now, whatever that situation is. Um, with error messages, I did want to go off and just briefly say that the it is part of WCAG. The Web Content Accessibility Web Content Accessibility Guidelines do cover error messages. I don't think there's any automated tools that do, but it is a really important part of this, especially if you're worried about losing your users and they get an error that they can't understand, or that's not in a language that they can comprehend. If it's sometimes I've gotten errors that are just numbers or strings that, just even as a technical person, I look at this and say, this is just somebody who was too lazy to go off and put in a human equivalent form. The only way you could possibly know what this error would be to look in a search it up in a table on a spreadsheet that has the errors versus what the human readable definition of this is, or maybe it's just lost in code somewhere, so that it pops up and I have to search through the code base in order to find out what this error means. But errors are really important, and I think that is an area where we often lose people, and a lot of people are used to having government forms that don't work properly, and government, because the myth is that government doesn't understand technology. Sadly, there's a lot of websites that there's definitely reality in that in some contexts. But if people already are coming to your website and your service believing that the technology is going to fail, and then they get an error that they don't understand, they're not going to assume it's their fault. They're not going to assume that they got the information incorrect. They're going to think that this is something that the government screwed up again. And this is another example of how government can't get it right and can't provide me the services I'm owed. Um, yeah, I think that's an important piece of it. Also, I should mention this earlier, but we often design forms too with a bunch of assumptions that just aren't accurate. Like we tend to think about asking for people's first and last names, because that's such a normal part of how we interact with people in the West. But not all cultures have that. And there's some interesting examples of how people have taken yeah, things that are forms are often wrong. Even like common things, some names like Odun, for example, or any hyphenated or names with apostrophes, people get that wrong because they're not doing the user research to say what are actually people going to be filling in. So taking that time to consider how people's names are entered is really quite important as well. And what else is there? There's that, and trying to remind users when they're creating their sorry, reminding authors when they're creating the form about who it is who's filling it in, and providing some building a basic persona to try and help build some empathy around that, so that people have a sense that, oh yeah, these are people who may not be operating in their first language. This may be something that they're not, they may be using some other tool in order to help understand what is being asked of them, or even having to
Yeah.
ask a friend or family member to help them fill in the form.
Yeah. You mentioned something in there around um, uh, the role that the form plays, or the emotions associated with the form, or the broken trust that can happen if something goes wrong, or your experience isn't handled properly, what kind of happens. So like as form creators, we kind of have a responsibility to make people feel safe
Yeah.
and to like maintain some kind of trust through this process. So a consistency of experience, which some of those things can be very technical. Like some of
Right.
those things we can do to make people feel safe and make the experience feel trustworthy are like, let them opt out of questions. I don't know the answer to this question, actually. Or
Yeah.
I prefer not to answer this question if at all possible. Um, and then just the ability to save and finish later. You know what? I can't do this right now. Let me save this. I'm going to come back later when I'm not in stress, and I can come and I can kind of finish this. And
Mhm.
then the gold standard, if you can do it, is like just tell people, see them, and say, "We recognize this is a hard question,
Yeah.
right? You don't have to answer this right now." You know, take a minute, take care of yourself, come back later. Like if you can do that, um, then like those are mechanical things you can do, right? Um, and then on the errors message side of things, you talked about this too, like in form fields, like form fields should be forgiving, right?
Mhm.
You're going to enter the wrong characters. You're going to have apostrophes. Like you're going to do things that aren't so strict, based on information types. If you can make things more forgiving, right, then people can make mistakes and it's okay. And then you mentioned error messages before, as far as content guidelines, like there's a voice. Your form has a voice. Your content has a voice, and the kinder you can be, then you're not going to like shame people out of a process, or your error messages aren't going to like alienate people, but they're actually going to kind of catch people and stuff. So these are all very mechanical things we can do that are part of form creation, but they are going to be informed, like you said, personas and research. Let me understand this person, and let me provide like content creators with information. Because I think the other thing you brought up too is like the designer might have all this information. Great for you, designer. You understand the user, but the technologist doesn't have this information. The person who handles the data doesn't have this information. And even the
Yeah.
policy writer doesn't have this information. So how do we as designers empower these other researchers, empower these other people who want the information? I just need it in the form. When I go to write this question, you need to remind me in the CMS like what I am doing, help me be a better content creator, and because I don't have the empathetic connection you have. So I think sometimes there is a disconnect between the designer has like an intent, but it's so far, like you're saying, from the people who are doing the work that
Yeah.
there's a missed opportunity there to kind of like just shove all this stuff down. So it takes a highly collaborative process to like allow engineers the enough context so they can be compassionate, or like allow content creators enough context so they can actually, like you're saying, do some of the things that need to be done for this specific user. But that takes a lot of collaboration up front, um, which it can be complicated.
But
Um,
there's like for accessibility, there's ways to help support that the transfer of information from designers to front end engineers by having the accessibility annotations. And so Figma and Storybook and others have a number of ways to go off and to annotate what it is that the semantics you're trying to get across and what is the meaning of it. So you're not just relying on the visuals to go off and convey what an engineer is supposed to build. I don't know of a similar kind of effort to pass along that meaning with for the data analysts or the form editors themselves, other than perhaps just trying to make sure that there is that communication early on, and you're actually bringing in the data specialists into conversations with designers early on, so that there is the ability to understand how this is going this form is how this data is going to be used, and also how an author might interpret the fields that they're being presented with.
um, you're right. Accessibility can be annotating trauma-informed use cases is harder. There's some
Mhm.
links in the chat. The folks have added. So Rachel Dekas uh, is sort of masterful in this area. She's written a bunch of things around trauma-informed design. That book, Design with Care, she's in that book as well. She wrote a chapter of it. Um, it's a really good book. Kind of talks about like how to approach this process, best practices. So thanks, folks, for adding those links. Um, yeah, and again, a lot of it, I think, yeah, there, like you said, there's the intent, there's the understanding, and there's the technical implementation, and kind of how that actually meets the user where they are. So we're kind of entering QA territory. So if people have questions, feel free to add them to the chat in Zoom, and we'll kind of get to them as they come in. Otherwise, we have a couple of follow-up questions we can kind of also talk about if nobody has any questions. But yeah, otherwise,
I have a
thanks. Please,
Sorry, I have a
please.
question. Just felt easier to speak it versus chatting. I hope that's okay. Um, I really appreciated what you were saying about kind of using AI to really like try to phrase things in multiple ways and come up with that proper phrasing. And of course, but also what you said about user research really being key. And I also was reading about Exygy and saw that you guys, one of the thoughtful design principles is finding the people closest to the margins. So on that note, I was just curious, how do you find those people? Like, how do you determine who is closest to the margins? Like, is there research done to determine who you should even be doing the research with to begin with, if that makes sense?
We're at Exygy, we're lucky enough when we first connect in an engagement to have community partners who have relationships with the various communities that are affected. And so we typically rely on those relationships. So they can be community benefits organizations, who already kind of represent the people who are most immediately affected by whatever design solution that we're going to be proposing, and we rely on their relationships and connections to connect us with those people, and which then brings us into a kind of co-design set of activities, where as much as possible we try to invite those people to be part of the design activities, the ideation activities, and kind of think through, do we really understand the problem, one, and then two, once we start to get into ideas, um, uh, that they're part of that solutioning. But I'll pass it to Mike to see if he has some additions there.
I think that there certainly are organizations out there that can help, that have that may be able to have people who are willing to volunteer or are interested in trying to contribute their expertise to new projects. There's a challenge with certainly in the accessibility world, but I'm sure also in low income communities as well around how do you compensate people for their time, because that is a real challenge, and you can't pay your rent with gift cards. Most places do not accept gift cards if you know when you need to go off and to you might work for groceries but not a lot else. So how do you try and find that mechanism to support people? I think it's also useful to, like, open source solutions do have a lot of potential as well, and that there are ways to bring people in and to engage people, but especially to be able to ask, like in any um, I really appreciate what the UK and Europe have done around accessibility statements as part of websites, and trying to make sure that you're actually looking for that feedback. It's not like in most US government websites, if there's an accessibility statement, it's simply, we meet section 508. 508. If you have complaints, fill in a form and it'll go to our section 508 office. That's not what most people want to do. They want to be able to get their needs met. They want to apply for this form. They don't want to submit a grievance. So how do you try and make it clear that if somebody runs into a problem, that it is a priority for the team to fix it, and that there will be people there to address this issue, whatever the barriers that they're trying to address. So again, you can ask for information online, or ask for input online to make sure that you're building a form that keeps up with the needs of your users today.
Yeah, to build on that, and that we can, I want you to feel free to ask your other question in real time as well. But those relationships get richer with time. So those relationships with those communities get richer. So with Exygy, like over time, invests in relationships with specific communities, and so over time, you're not just dropping in, but you have an ongoing connection with them, and then it's enriching the overall design experience. So, like for example, last time we met last month, Lighthouse for the Blind was working with us. We've been working with them for 10 years, and so over time, like whenever we have an issue, we don't try to recreate that. They have a lived experience we don't have. We want to bring them in to make sure that they're giving us direct feedback on how whatever experience affects them, or and getting it straight from them. But did you want to ask your follow-up question as well, and we kind of answer that
Oh,
loosely?
yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, so my other question was just, I also found what you were saying about just the conditions people are filling things out in really interesting. And that's something I've been very curious about myself, is how, of course, we can't really actually put them in those conditions for testing. So what's like the best and most ethical way to do that to really get the best results on how to design things?
Yeah. I've seen this done a bunch of different ways, and one of the ways is, as much as possible, go to where they are. Like, if they're going into a place to fill out applications, see their caseworker, go to where their caseworker's office is, because they're in that mental model. This is where I go to get this assistance. You're coming to them. You're not asking them to come to some sterile design office or whatever your office and talk. So you go meet them, and that's super helpful. And but there's a context you want to set, like in affordable housing. We also have to say, like, some people don't know what a design researcher is. So you have to say, hey, this is not an affordable housing application. I can't get you housing, so you have to kind of normalize the relationship. Um, and then there is some people have written about this, like, um, you're you want to be as upfront as possible. Is that, again, the questions I'm going to be asking you to answer are going to be, could be triggering. You can end this interview at any time. You want to ask the person to be as authentic as they can be. Um, but you also, some things that we do in a testing environment is we pay them up front. Here's the money for this engagement. If you get triggered or this gets too stressful, you can leave. You know what I mean? You getting compensated is not, you're not going to be rewarded for getting this right? We're compensating for your time fairly upfront, so reduce that part of the process. We can kind of set up weird dynamics, and uh, yeah, if they need to have someone in the room with them, like when we do testing with somebody who in English is not their first language, we have someone in the room with them in real time who in most cases works at the counseling agency that they're with, so they have a trusted proxy who's there as well, who's able to kind of like again ground them in the environment and kind of set them up to be successful. But yeah, it's difficult. Again, like if you can meet with the same people over time, and again, like with Crop, which is again the same organization that is working with folks who are formerly incarcerated. We could meet with the same people over time, so we almost had like a user group, and so we got to know them over time. We built trust over time with those people, and they were more, I believe, more accurately able to communicate like authentic experiences to us, but that was a relationship we had to and build up over time.
It occurred to me that there's a huge opportunity to connect with people who have a vested interest in fixing this as a problem, who see this as a problem, because there are going to be people who just are applying to the forum. But if there's a caseworker or somebody who's familiar with this audience, they might know people who are just really angry with what they're being asked for, what the process is, and would be interested in investing their time in fixing the problem. And I think that sometimes the problem isn't it's a lot more, it's a lot deeper. Like if you can see a person who is, what is the device that they're using to go off and to fill in the form? What is their, like, is it a cracked mobile phone that has only partial functionality? Like that'd be really interesting to sort of test on that, because probably that's not the phone that you have. Likewise, if you're, or if it's shitty bandwidth, or whatever the challenges, whatever that person's dealing with, if you can see that. It's also useful if you could potentially record it, because I think one of the ways to get the question simplified is to show people how complicated it is for people to fill in the forms, because a lot of the government employees who are building these forms they have good intentions, but they're thinking about somebody filling in the form like them, who's sitting in a light controlled office that has a fully functioning keyboard, and is, the system might be slow, but they know it's going to work. And then when they hit submit, that the right things are going to happen, at least from their computer's perspective, because there's an IT team that can help with that. Most people don't have an IT team, particularly if you're looking for social assistance. But the other side is that sometimes you do need to, um, sometimes there are things that you have to ask people to do that may be uncomfortable for them if you're going to solve the problem. Like there's a kind of disability called visually induced motion sickness, or vertigo. It's caused by like motion on the screen of the devices, and you can design a web page to make people physically ill, where they can actually have to go off and take time off because they cannot function after having seen the screen. So I think it's useful to remind people of that, and also to do as much as you can to make sure you're not going to make people ill when you ask them to do user testing. But sometimes you still need to ask, because there's no automated way to go off and identify these challenges.
All right, are we at time? I think we're at time. Is that it? So thank you so much. It was a really engaging conversation. Thank you, everybody who put comments and questions and resources in the chat. I put Mike's email in the chat. Mike, feel free to add additional links. I added some stuff for Exygy if you want to stay in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to try to do another one of these next month, I think.